He had me remove my deer from the truck. He loaded it up. He gave me a citation for improperly tagging a deer, and a receipt for the deer if I ever was able to come pick it up. Well, at that point, it pretty much ruined my trip, and I kept pretty much beating myself up over what I'd done wrong. And of course, hindsight's 20/20. I got on my wallet and I started looking at the fact that I had, my regular license, hip stamp, duck stamp, 2 antlerless only tags. I had my either species tag. I had a pocket full of these green tags. And I know that when I got in my wallet, I remember seeing the either species, but ultimately that's not what I came out of my wallet with. And I did not go back and check and reassure that I had the right tag. So I was wrong, and I fully admit I was wrong. We got into the legal aspect of it, and it really kind of got to me a little bit there, because I had tried to get this resolved early, could never get an appointment with Kevin up there, the prosecuting attorney, and all I kept getting was his secretary. Well, I finally got back from her that what the prosecuting attorney wanted to do was $500 fine, $500 for, what was it, something else. It was a grand total of $1,300 for this fine, and $200 of that $13 was for a diversion. The diversion is a 6-month probation. I mean, by the time this got done, I've never felt so much like a criminal in all my life. For something that I felt that I didn't really mean, there was absolutely no intent to break the law here, and now I'm thrust in the middle of this. I tried to look at my options. I tried to get a defense attorney. That's $1,000 up front. The best he could do was say, I can maybe get you a diversion, but we can't guarantee you're going to get your deer back. And I mean, it just seemed like everyone I talked to said there was very little chance of me ever getting my deer back on this thing. I could have gone in front of the judge and taken my chances and would have wound up having this on my record possibly for a couple of years or longer. I didn't want to take that gamble, so I opted to take the prosecuting attorney's deal. So now I'm on 6 months probation, and I paid the $1,300 fine. Now, my issue is, I think you guys bear a little bit of responsibility in this also. And that is, and I've called Pratt, and I've talked to, I'm not sure who it was I talked to, the person that was supposed to be responsible for the content on these tags. And my issue is, these tags, well, as you can see, the subject of the tag, whether it be a doe tag, turkey tag, that's why I buy this tag. That's what I want. I could care less about all this other information on here. But it is the finest print on here, okay? But now there's a message on here that you guys want to get across to me about protecting my waterways. You can all read this, can't you? Pretty much. But you can sure read this better than you can read this. What I'm simply saying is, had this been bolder print up here, when I pulled this out of my wallet to fill it out, I would have had a better chance of correcting my mistake by seeing bolder print up here than what I was stuck with. With this, I'm 60 years old. I would have had to refocus my eyes to double check to make sure that I had the right tag in my hand. But I didn't. I assumed I pulled it out of my wallet, I had the right one, and I filled it out and put it on the deer. Plain and simple. So what I'm asking you guys, they told me there wasn't enough room on these tags to go to bolder print. Really? I mean, these things got plenty of room on them. All I'm asking for people in the future, let's go to bigger, bolder print so that they can see at a glance what this tag is for when they pull it out of their wallet. I guess that's about all I've got to say. Thank you for your time.
Any way to get the vendor to do that, Chris?
I don't know. You'll have to ask licensing. That's who handles that. There are, to address his concerns about the amount of information, some of that information is required to be on there by our regulations, you know, the date and time of the harvest and things like that. As to the size of the paper or the size of the font, that's not something I particularly deal with. We'd have to talk to the administrative services licensing folks to see if there's some other modification.
Mr. Chairman, I'd move that we ask the department to try to do their best to try to make them a little bit more easier to read and bigger. I had the same problem trying to read mine, knowing if the vendor even gave me the right ones sometimes. I do think we can make an effort to improve them.
Is there a way for the department to, rather than make this gentleman go through more, that the department can ask licensing to possibly?
No, that's what I'm saying. We're going to have to talk to licensing to see what the possibilities are.
Okay.
For me to give you an answer, I can't.
But we're going to try
without talking to licensing and having them talk to the vendors.
Okay.
Well,
The field is a set field. It will only hold so much information, and it is a set font based off of our tools. But we can see if anything can be changed. But it's, I mean, it's only so big with the form on there.
I've taken myself to writing on the back of them with a Sharpie pen and big print, so that and I do understand.
That is completely different than the wording up on the license.
I'd get a different vendor.
Well, it's easier said than I think there's only about one vendor in the United States that handles most of this. And
Well, then we need another one. That's what competition's about.
well, and I don't mean to be flippant about it, because it is it's very unfortunate. I'm speechless as to exactly what to do. So
Mr. Chairman, we'll take a look at it and see if we can't
I'd appreciate
figure out
that.
a better way.
I'd appreciate that. And thanks for your time, sir.
From a company. See an opportunity.
Any other public comment? Okay, general discussion, Keith and Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jim and I, and I'm just going to make this rather short and then introduce Jim to give you some specifics, but we're here again this evening to give you an update and a briefing on the status of the lesser prairie chicken listing and the work that's going on by the 5 states and other partners to develop a range-wide lesser prairie chicken management plan. The fact is that since our last meeting, you all, I'm sure, know by now that the Fish and Wildlife Service did do a proposed listing of threatened for the lesser prairie chicken. And that includes the 5 states, Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico. And so we're continuing to proceed, as we were before, to develop this management plan that will be turned in to the Fish and Wildlife Service in March, early March, for their consideration before they make a final determination, essentially in September of 2013. One thing I want to point out is that because of the listing, the Fish and Wildlife Service is required to hold public meetings. And so in your briefing book, we did include public meetings going to be held on February the 7th in Garden City at the Garden City Community College from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. And that's a meeting that's being sponsored by the Fish and Wildlife Service to discuss the listing process and things that they have to impart on the public and solicit information. Tonight, we got 3 people that essentially have just been working almost day and night on this thing, and Jim is really kind of our lead person on the interstate working group. And I even offered to send flowers to his wife at one point, and he says, no, don't bother. He said, it just probably agitate things worse. But anyway, she's probably watching tonight, so now we're in trouble. But at any rate, he and Eric Johnson is also a part of that team, and then Mike Houts, who does our GIS work for us, has been a part. And these guys have been almost 24/7 working on this thing just to meet the deadlines, and the other states have equally put time into this effort as well. But I think when we're finished, we're going to have a heck of a plan that covers all of as much or all that we understand to be those things that the Fish and Wildlife Service need to make their final determination, and then it's sort of in their hands. So tonight, Jim is going to give you the latest update on where the plan exists and the kind of the Kansas perspective and the Kansas involvement in the plan. So we'll keep you posted as we go along, and Jim's going to give you the detail. Thanks, Jim.
I've got 10 or 12 slides here. I'm going to talk about it. I hope you can see them from there. We planned on having the presentation up top, and our AV guy went home and put the screens up, so we had to improvise. So if you can see better, can you see okay from where you're at? Okay. Keith's kind of already touched on the process that's led to where we're at today, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. But as he mentioned, the service did publish a proposed rule of threatened. Came out in early December. Right now we're in the 90-day comment period on that proposed rule, and those comments are going to be due on March 11th. And during that time period, the states, specifically the Western Association, collectively are going to be submitting some comments on their proposed rule. And during the same time period, we're working on the range-wide management plan that Keith mentioned, that also has a similar deadline of the end of March. And we have that deadline set at the end of March so that the service will have time to take into consideration the items that are proposed in that plan before they make a final ruling, scheduled to be done in September. If the final ruling does come out in September as planned, and there's a possibility of a 90-day extension, but if it does come out in September, then the status, or whatever they propose, will take effect 30 days later, so probably in October. The plan that we're working on, I'm going to touch on some of the general goals today and the process. The first objective of the plan is to secure the future of the lesser prairie chicken through voluntary efforts, conservation efforts into the future. And we hope that we can do that sufficiently enough to preclude the service from listing the species as federally threatened. The plan is being coordinated by the Lesser Prairie Chicken Interstate Working Group, which has one representative from each of the 5 affected states, of which Kansas is representative. The other states that are part of this effort are Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado. We've contracted with a consulting firm out of Montana called the Environmental Management Research Institute to actually write the plan. We're putting the pieces together, and our contractor is pulling that all together to meet our timelines for the plan. The planning process has involved and will continue to involve government agencies that are responsible for implementing conservation efforts for the species or that affect the species, academia, landowners, industry, energy industry primarily, non-government organizations, and the general public. And to facilitate the planning process, we've established 3 working groups that are listed there, one of which being a science team made up of academics and managers that have experience with lesser prairie chickens, a voluntary offset committee, and a conservation banking committee. And those committees are designed to take some of the tools that come out of the science team and figure out a way to utilize them to develop systems for voluntary offsets or credit trading or conservation banking and the like. We also have state-specific implementation teams, which we've convened. We've had ours in Kansas already, and those teams have specific tasks of trying to coordinate amongst the different federal, state, and NGOs that deliver conservation programs so that we're all out there selling the same message to landowners when we're out there trying to convince them to do voluntary conservation for the bird. Those are going to eventually become more regional scale implementation teams once the plan gets completed, so that we'll the state lines will go away. We'll be managing the species at a larger scale. And finally, we've already had some public meetings here in Kansas to roll out some of the products that have been developed, and we are planning to have a few more in February, the end of February. We haven't set the dates yet on when those will be, but we're also soliciting public comment. We have done that and we'll continue to do so. Some of the major products that are going to come out of this plan are range-wide and regional population and habitat goals for the bird. And we're going to also be identifying some of the best locations for conservation and responsible energy development throughout the range of the species, throughout the 5-state range. And another big component is developing a set of metrics to estimate habitat for the species, and those metrics will be used to guide, say for example, voluntary offsets or conservation banking to ensure that habitat that gets destroyed through development gets replaced in sufficient quantities in the right locations. And another major component of the plan is identifying and facilitating future research to fill in gaps where we have knowledge gaps, and that will allow us to revise the plan with scientific information in the future. This map depicts the different ecoregions at which we're going to be trying to manage the species, of which there are 4. The northern part of the range there encompasses northwest and west central Kansas. We're calling it the shortgrass prairie, CRP mosaic. We've also got the sand sage that encompasses southwest Kansas into southeast Colorado, dips into Oklahoma a bit as well. And the mixed grass prairie that encompasses the red hills of Kansas, extends all the way down into the northeast panhandle of Texas. And finally, we've got the sand shinnery ecoregion in New Mexico and Texas, of which we don't have any part. We've set our population goals for the draft version of this plan at 66,000 birds, and to come up with that number, we looked at an aerial survey that we completed this spring in which we estimated the population to be 37,000. We then back forecast that looking at some of our trend data, and 66,000 is pretty close to what we've had in recent past. The 37,000 that we've got right now is significantly less, but it's mostly due to weather. The habitat's still out there to support those birds. It's just the significant drought that we're under that's caused those bird numbers to drop. Anyway, that 66,000 birds is then split out amongst the different ecoregions. We've set an initial draft goal of 30,000 for the shortgrass region, 6,000 for the sand sage, 20,000 for the mixed grass, and 10,000 for the sand shinnery oak. To support those population goals, we've developed the concept of habitat focal areas. And those focal areas are going to delineate areas on the landscape where we want to target voluntary conservation, and there'll also be priority areas for voluntary minimization and or avoidance of energy development. And we're working with energy industry really closely to try to come to some agreement on how that will actually happen. But these focal areas will play a big part of it. The focal areas were selected using the following guidelines. We first based them off those population goals. Then we made the recommendation to our science team that 75% of those population goals had to be maintained within the focal areas. The remaining 25% would be maintained in the rest of the range. So we're not going to forget about everything else. We're going to also keep those birds outside of the focal areas to the best of our ability as well. Within the focal areas, the guidelines are that they'll maintain greater than 70% high-quality habitat once they're fully implemented. They don't have to have 70% high-quality habitat right now, but that's the goal for the focal areas. And finally, they can't be separated by greater than 20 miles, and the intent of that spacing is so that we'll have population exchange between the different focal areas, both genetically and demographically. That should help support the birds over the larger range-wide scale. To achieve those things and our population goals, we've estimated initially that we need a minimum of 6.3 million acres across the range, and we based that figure off of the fact that we have an average population of about 5 birds per square mile across the range. And as we're going through the revision process, this may be one of the pieces that gets changed. what I thought best pieces of information to delineate where we have existing populations, those areas that we have high potential for restoration, and also tried to avoid energy impacts or conflicts as much as possible. So I selected areas that had low potential for oil and gas development, areas that had low wind potential, and those sort of things to try to avoid any conflicts that might pop up. I took that straw man then that I put together to our state implementation team that's made up of state and federal conservation agencies and had them kind of go over it and edit it, and we made some revisions based on their comments. We then took those draft focal areas to some public meetings, of which we held 3 in western Kansas back in November, and we had about a 2-month period for public comments. We've received a handful of those public comments. We're also making some changes potentially, as I mentioned, to how we're going to delineate the needed number of acres for each of these focal areas. So once I have those figures, I'm going to take the public comments that we solicited through our meetings and do another revision for the final plan. To date, the draft focal areas are depicted here on the map. You can't really see that all that clearly, but I have some handouts back on the back table that show where these are located in Kansas. I also have some copies that I'll pass out to the commissioners if you'd like to see. I saved a few hard copies back for you here, just to see what we've delineated initially. In all likelihood, as I mentioned earlier, we needed a minimum of 6.3 million acres based on the criteria that we set initially. We've actually got about 8.9 million selected. So once we make revisions to how we identify the needed number of acres, it's likely that these focal areas are going to get smaller. We'll probably shrink them within the boundaries of what we've already delineated. So what you're seeing there on that map is going to be the general location of where we actually have focal areas in the final plan. And right now we have 4.5 million acres delineated in Kansas, which, got us a problem. While he's working on that, we have 4.5 million acres delineated in Kansas. That figure is probably going to come down somewhat. Some of the other ecoregions down in the south, particularly in New Mexico and Texas, may need to be increased. So they've got a little bit different situation than us. Thanks, Mike. We're also going to be identifying what we're calling connectivity zones. We haven't done that yet, so I don't have anything to show you, but those connectivity zones are going to bridge that 20-mile gap I talked about earlier between the different focal areas. And they have a little bit different goals than the focal areas. They're not quite as stringent. They'll be secondary in priority to the focal areas, but we're also going to be trying to maintain at least 40% suitable habitat within those connectivity zones, and that will be to facilitate movement across some of those landscapes. Another major piece of the plan that I mentioned earlier was quantification of habitat. There's a huge need to have a uniform method to identify or quantify habitat across the range to guide some of these voluntary offset programs or even mitigation if we get into the regulatory format. So we've worked with our science team, of which I've chaired, to come up with a set of metrics to do that. And there's multiple pieces that go into the metrics, of which I'm going to spell them out here pretty quickly for you. They're very detailed. I'm not going to get into the weeds about all the details. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the pieces that go into that calculation. First thing that we'll have to do if you have a piece of property, you're trying to identify impacts or improvements to habitat conservation projects, will be identifying the baseline acres. So for example, on that map on the left, let's just assume that's a 100-acre pasture. Before you estimate baseline acres, you would apply buffers onto the existing energy developments and or other anthropogenic features that have a negative impact on lesser chickens, and those buffer distances have been developed by our science team using the best available information in the literature. This is one of the areas where we'll probably need to revise with some of the research that comes out in the future, but we put together these buffer distances to the best of our ability. So anyway, once those buffer distances are applied, you would then estimate you would calculate the amount of acreage that is not affected, and that would be your baseline acres. If a new development goes in to that same area, for example, a power line, which I've got depicted here, you would put the location of the proposed project on that same map, apply the buffers that we've agreed upon through our science team, estimate the number of acres that fall, number of previously unimpacted acres that fall within that new buffer. And that's where you'd start for estimating impacts. The next step then is to apply a multiplier to those acreage figures to downgrade them basically. And those multipliers then are the ecological site descriptions that NRCS puts together. Those ecological site descriptions are ranked 1 through 10 by lesser chicken management experts. And and for example, a site that has maximum potential for creating vegetation suitable for the species would receive a score of 1. So you would maintain the same number of acres you started with. The other piece then is existing vegetative quality and amount of habitat nearby the particular parcel you're evaluating. We put a very specific tool together that will require folks to go out on to these properties and actually do a vegetative assessment. And then based on what kind of vegetation's on the site, there will be another multiplier applied that falls between 0 and 1. Once you apply the starting effective acreage and the two multipliers that I've just mentioned, you'll end up with a figure which is the unweighted habitat units for each of those properties, for the particular property you're evaluating. Those unweighted habitat units then will be weighted based on their priority for lesser chicken conservation. And we're identifying priority by where the particular property falls within the landscape. We've previously developed a tool called the Crucial Habitat Assessment Tool, and we did that for the Western Governors Association a couple years ago to help guide energy development in lesser chicken range. And you can see that the areas that are in bright red on this map are the areas with the highest priority, all the way down to the gray, which are low priority, and the areas that aren't shaded at all are the lowest priority. This tool is going to be how we weight those unweighted habitat units in the calculation. And at the same time we're developing the plan, we're going to be updating this tool to incorporate the focal areas that I've just talked about. So those focal areas are going to receive the highest weighting. So if a development goes into a focal area, those habitat units are going to be weighted by a factor of 10. Whereas if it goes in somewhere that's common, down here in an area that's not shaded, it'll be weighted to 0, so there'll be no impact to the species. And you'll notice that on the other side, for the offset, when somebody's trying to estimate number of acres improved through conservation actions, those weightings are only half as much as what they'll receive on the impact side for a property in the same location. And that was done by intent so that those acres that get destroyed, it get doubled. The amount replaced is doubled what gets destroyed in theory. And the different rankings have the same sort of ratio all the way down the list until you get to the bottom and to some of the more common habitats, and then we're looking at a 1-to-1 ratio for the offset. The fourth thing you would apply on the impact side, once you have the weighted habitat units, well, you have to apply a duration, because when you build something, for example, like a power line or an oil and gas well, it's not just there for 1 year, it's there for a long time. And this is one of the things that voluntary offset committee is working on. And right now they're kind of throwing around the figure of 30 to 50 years duration for most of these different types of developments. And energy industry folks are involved in that decision, so this is not something that will be new to them. So that's kind of a quick and dirty summary of some of the major pieces of the plan. As I mentioned, when this is done, it's going to guide conservation efforts to ensure the sustainability of the species, and that's probably going to be the case whether the service decides to list the bird as threatened or not. The draft plan is going to be done in February with a short public comment period, and we're on a tight timeline here to meet that March final deadline at the end of March, so the service will be able to consider all this information. So it'll probably pop up somewhere online for comments, and then we'll quickly turn those around into a final plan. And as Keith mentioned, that final rule is scheduled to be published at the end of September. Hopefully we'll get a 90-day extension and delay that until December, but we won't know if that happens or not until March, if my understanding is correct. So with that, I'd be glad to take any questions.
I have a question.
You bet.
Mr. Pittman, do you think that the lesser prairie chicken should be listed?
I don't think a listing would be a benefit to the species. I actually think it would be a detriment because it would take a lot of the people that have the best knowledge of lesser prairie chickens and their management out of the equation.
What's the consequences if it is listed versus not listed?
Consequences to who? We don't know for certain for any group. There's some, probably more likely that there'll be some regulation for energy development. I'm not sure what it would mean, if anything, to private landowners yet. But we won't know. The service can't answer that question.
So typically what happens when a species gets listed?
Mr. Chairman, I mean, there are two levels of complexity here. There's the federal level and the state level, and the Threatened and Endangered Species Act under the state level, I have a little more knowledge of.
You bet.
But on the federal level, it's going to depend on what they're called 4D rules and how they implement the rules to determine if it actually impacts certain activities. But certainly on the state level, one of the impacts would be if there's a publicly funded project or a project that requires another permit from another agency, then we would have to comment on it, and then it would require, one of our 3 steps ultimately could result in mitigation for loss of habitat.
Normal farming and ranching practices
It's not applicable.
are not affected because
Right.
they're not receiving federal money. If they are receiving federal money, then there may be some more regulation. And you made a good point about 4D rules. That's one of the things we're going to talk about for our next item, because they can allow some forms of incidental take, which could affect the way we hunt or if we hunt the birds. Yes.
I had read an article 2 months ago, maybe a month and a half ago, that really said that part of this was coming about. The listing was more from environmental and/or slowing down the oil and gas industry. That was the primary purpose of why they even were looking at listing.
One of the primary threats that the service identified to the species was energy development.
And I think what Tom was talking about, it goes even further, that the agency is somewhat being encouraged from environmental interests to do that. Do you have any sense that some of this is politics, or how would you ever know?
Some of those environmental entities are the ones that filed the initial petition, and they were also the ones that got a settlement in district court that forced the listing decision.
This is on the national litigation level, it's a much broader picture. There was the original petition that Jim talked about. There was a case that was filed in Colorado, in the District Court of Colorado, on the federal level to try to list the species. At the same time, there are 2 major environmental, I wouldn't say, 2 major groups that do a lot of endangered species litigation that were engaged with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and those 2 groups entered into settlements, which are a series of disputes that are ongoing. Those 2 groups are being sued, or the service is being sued on those 2 settlement issues. But they had specific timelines to list. For example, lesser prairie chicken, sage grouse, greater sage grouse is in there.
250 species, I believe.
There are 250 species, that's right. And I think there are 3 game species that are listed, and that would be lesser prairie chicken, greater sage grouse. And so in the meantime, that suit on lesser prairie chickens went away in Colorado as a result of that. And so at that time, then the service, it was last April, I think, they notified us that they were changing the priority listing on the species. So there are a lot of moving parts and unknowns. So to answer Roger's question in a roundabout way, I'm not sure we know what the impacts are going to be yet. It's pretty speculative at this point.
Do we assume that they will be listed?
I sure hope not. I sure hope what we're doing through this range-wide conservation planning effort will demonstrate enough voluntary effort to keep that from happening.
We have numbers down at the drought, and in the range-wide numbers, we're down 35% or something like that, but In the state of Kansas, we don't have that great a percentage decline from like 66,000 to 37,000 necessarily, do we? Or is it pretty much uniform across the range?
You know, depends on what time frame you look at, but let's say we look back to 97, or let's say 98, when the bird was first declared a candidate species. We've had increasing populations north of the Ark River, stable populations in the red hills and the mixed grass, and declining populations in the sand sage. Our statewide population and our statewide range has tripled in that time period. Our statewide population has probably doubled in that ballpark because of the expansion we've seen north of the Ark River as a result of CRP. So in Kansas, we're doing pretty well.
But is there a way we can get some sort of an exclusion, or if they become listed by the service, everybody gets screwed?
I think the latter.
Subject to litigation.
As we say in North Topeka.
You know, there are some possibilities, and it depends on the 4D rules, how those are written, and it also, I can tell you that there's been some litigation in the greater Yellowstone area, and it's the same thing. Can you hunt grizzly bears? And the standard in that case was, even though they were a threatened species, you couldn't hunt them because they were even though they were a detriment to themselves, it was still not allowed to hunt them. And I don't, you know, when something's eating themselves out of house and home, like megafauna, like a grizzly, to try to apply that to chickens, I don't know how that's going to work out. But it'll be difficult.
Jim, how did that go from a level 8 to a level 2? Is that a population metric, or what is that?
The argument was that the threats for particularly development had increased. The states disagreed with that, and we sent comment to the service with data indicating why we didn't think that was the case.
So that's commercial wind development in western Kansas and oil and gas.
Well, what's really driving it's oil and gas and wind development in Texas and Oklahoma.
Pipeline of an issue.
Say that again.
Isn't it the Keystone? What's the Keystone Pipeline project? Does that have anything to play in this?
I haven't seen that specifically mentioned anywhere.
That's farther east, the Keystone. Jim, you said you are working with the commercial wind companies then?
Yes.
Are they part of your conversation?
Yes.
Are they receptive or not receptive? I can imagine they're not receptive to setting aside large areas where they can't go gather the wind, right?
Well, actually, they're working with us pretty well. They're
Good.
down the road a pretty good ways with what's called a habitat conservation plan, which will do some of these voluntary efforts that we're talking about right now. They've kind of got the perspective that they'd rather work with us and do this voluntarily than be regulated by the feds. So, yeah, they're working with us.
Any more comments from the commission? Public? Ron?
I just wanted to address a couple of comments that were raised about the possibility of Ron Klataski from Manhattan. I just wanted to address a couple of comments. I think I saw the same article is an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal that Tom mentioned, and there's mention here about environmental groups trying to do this to throw roadblocks in front of oil and gas. And I can't speak for the groups that really brought the action that forced the Fish and Wildlife Service to look at this, but I have pretty broad knowledge of conservation and environmental groups that are interested in endangered species, and their motive is that they're concerned that these species are headed towards biologically being endangered. It's not, I don't think it's a political thing. I don't think there's any grand conspiracies involved in these things. Obviously, we do not want lesser prairie chickens to go the same way as the Atwater's prairie chicken, which is effectively extinct now in Texas. There are many of these species that are in trouble, and some entity has to bring it to the attention of the Fish and Wildlife Service to get them to address these issues because of the fact they're not going out there looking for more work to do. The greatest benefit, though, of all of this attention to this species is the development of these management plans and conservation plans and what can be done. We got all these different agencies involved. We got NRCS that's putting in a lot of money for practices that work with ranchers and farmers to benefit lesser prairie chickens. And so to this point, it's all highly beneficial. You know, when we get down there, whether they're listed or not, may be a whole different number of issues. But at this point, it's extremely beneficial, all the attention that's been devoted to the habitat needs of the species.
Other than the fact that in the state of Kansas, we have a population that's probably doubling and a range that's tripling, and we're still having to spend money to try to get people to realize that the species is in a reverse decline in the state of Kansas.
Well, we can't not necessarily say that, and we can't say it for a couple of reasons, because I don't think that they have been increasing in recent years. They did have a period where they expanded their range and increase, and that was to a large degree due to the Conservation Reserve Program. Well, last Tuesday, I think it was, on an NPR station, I heard Secretary Vilsack talk about reducing CRP from 32 million acres down to 22 million acres. We may see a reversal in the gains that have been, this population has realized as we start to lose more Conservation Reserve Program funding.
Of course, that would be consistent with NPR's opinion on things, wouldn't it?
It was not NPR that was saying this. This was the Secretary of Agriculture. And also, it was also repeated by Senator Grassley, who is not noted as an NPR liberal. He was pointing out that where the money is right now, that they're going to have to cut from the farm budget, is in conservation programs, and so there's a great risk that we may lose a lot of the habitat that the prairie chickens and the pheasants and many other species are enjoying. But if their plans may help to retain many of those, you know, priorities on chicken habitat and pheasant habitat and things, so that we'll all benefit as a result of this attention. So having Jim and these other people devote a lot of energy to this is not a waste of resources, in our opinion.
Okay. Any other comments? Good luck.
I hear that frequently.
Huh?
I hear that frequently.
Michael?
Jim, in our conversations, you've mentioned some special habitat programs kind of designed at lesser prairie chickens. I know a ranch that I photograph on and hunt on, they've tried to work with the habitat, but there are some programs that have been out there trying to encourage landowners. Is that correct?
You bet. NRCS has what they call a Lesser Prairie Chicken Conservation Initiative. Last year was the second year of that. They've spent about $20 million on private land habitat improvements.
And that's NRCS.
NRCS. And FSA, the Farm Service Agency, has also really changed the way they target CRP over the last few years to really put what acreage we do have into lesser chicken range.
Okay, I know that PR money could, if they're listed, Pittman-Robertson money couldn't be used for, you know, the birds because they're not hunted. But would the NRCS program still be ongoing to help the prairie chicken habitat?
That's a decision they'd have to make in Washington. I think that it'll probably be around.
Okay, but it is possible.
You bet. It could, that could change.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Thanks.
You bet. I'm up here again.
All right. Any better news?
Not really.
Thank you.
All right, fire away.
Next item relates to the one we just talked about, and that is it's 11525-1. Specifically, I want to talk about prairie chicken hunting seasons, bag limits, and possession limits. And based on what you've just heard, you can tell that there's probably a lot of confusion about how a listing would affect our ability to hunt the birds if it happens. Right now, we don't know what that means. I suspect that if that extension's not granted that we talked about, and they go ahead with a final ruling scheduled to be published in September. We're going to have to come back to you sometime, probably June, August, and an October vote that would come right after the final ruling hits the Federal Register. And during that process, we're going to need to change the way that we delineate our hunt units for chickens so we can minimize the amount of hunting that gets lost if a listing occurs. I suspect what we're going to have to do, and if you look at the materials I put in the briefing book, I put a map in there that shows you the range of the species, and it shows you where we have just lesser prairie chickens, where we have lesser and greater prairie chickens, and where we have just greater prairie chickens. I suspect what we're going to have to do is delineate those different population segments into different hunt units so that regardless of how the service defines those 4D rules for incidental take, we'll be able to respond quickly and minimize the loss of hunting opportunity. So possibly we'll be back to you with some recommendations to do that this summer.
All right. Any questions on that? Any questions from the public? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. This is a public hearing item. We discussed it, we workshopped it at the last meeting. It's basically a result of House Bill 314 or Senate Bill 314, where we changed the exemption age for senior licenses. And the way the federal regulation requires us to have the HIP stamp, the Harvest Information Program stamp, but anyone that has to have a hunting license must have that. And what we had in our previous regulation was the age, the 16 to 64. And so what we did here is we amended that out to relate it back to the statute that points out who needs a license, rather than using the age any longer. And so anybody that has to, any resident that must have a hunting license also has to have a HIP stamp. And while doing that, we also cleaned it up a little bit. It's not really a stamp, it's just a permit. It would be just a privilege that would be on your license when you purchased it. So we changed that wording to clean that up a little bit.
So when you buy a license, you'll have to buy a HIP stamp?
If you're going to hunt migratory birds, yes.
Okay.
It's the same now. For most of us, we buy a HIP stamp, a state stamp, and a federal waterfowl stamp. But those that were under 16 or over the age of 65 did not need a HIP stamp prior to this. So we needed to change that. We needed to amend this regulation so that it's still fit, that anybody that needs a license does need a HIP stamp or HIP permit. A HIP permit is $250.
That includes the fees and everything.
Uh-huh.
It's $1 for the stamp, isn't it?
The stamp doesn't, yeah, it's just basically the convenience fee and the vendor fee that goes to. We don't get any of that.
Okay, any questions on this? I think we need to vote on this one. Any questions from the public? Can I have a motion?
I move to adopt.
Second.
Who is
You've
the
had a-
second?
Dawn?
Thank you.
We've had a motion and a second. Any more discussion? You want to call roll, Sheila?
Commissioner Bolton?
Yes.
Commissioner Budd?
Yes.
Commissioner Dill?
Yes.
Commissioner Dahl?
Yes.
Commissioner Marshall?
Yes.
Commissioner Wilson?
Yes.
Commissioner Lauber?
Yes.
Passed.
All right.
Thank you.
Mr. Mitchner.
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, as you may remember, we had a little issue with one of our new falconry regulations that was in conflict with the federal regulations. What we're voting on tonight is a revised regulation that cleans that issue up, and that issue dealt with the bands that needed to go on certain of the falconry raptors, and we're just cleaning that regulation up so that we're consistent with
with the new federal regulations. So with that, I'll stand for any questions.
Anybody have any questions for Mike?
Move to approve.
Second. There's some public. Yes, we have public, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission, on behalf of Audubon of Kansas, I'd like to comment on the falconry regulations. Most specifically, I think that you need to put a new provision in here on page 2, after section 4 ABC. Following that, we need a provision in here that allows and directs the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks to manage raptor species by species and not just lump them all in a big group here. You certainly wouldn't do upland game bird hunting regulations by putting turkeys and lesser prairie chickens and everything all in one big basket and then just having one set of regulations to them. And the reason that I'm concerned is because of the fact that we have some species in jeopardy that we are currently allowing falconers to take from Indiana, Iowa, come in from anywhere because they can't get them in other places in many situations, so they come here to get them. And in particular, I want to point out Ferruginous hawks, which once nested throughout western Kansas and now may be close to, if not already extinct as a nesting species in the state of Kansas. And I think it is, not a credit to our stewardship of wildlife resources if we allow the take of ferruginous hawks. I don't know if Mike has any feel for how many nesting successes we have in the state for ferruginous hawks, but I can tell you it is very few. And I only know of one nesting attempt specifically, and I don't know of all areas. They did surveys years ago, and they found that most of them were vanishing. At one point, there were like 26 nesting sites in Wallace County, and because of primarily due to the poisoning of prairie dogs in Wallace County, they all perished, all the nesting sites.
What kind of hawk is this?
Ferruginous hawk. And we've had some nesting, there have been some nesting sites on the Haverfield Barnhart Blank properties in recent years, but there was one nesting attempt there this year and it was not successful. And so I think, but there were people there from Indiana, a group of 4 people out there trying to hunt down ferruginous hawks to capture them and take them for falconry. There was one guy there from Iowa that was out there. And the department does not know how many and of what kinds of birds are being taken at this point. At least I did a Freedom of Information request here a couple of months ago, and for the most part, the permits, there was no indication, no knowledge of knowing what was taken. And so I think we really need to get a handle on this, and I think that it would be beneficial if we would put it in there, and the department then would be managing species. There may be some species like red tails where there's no particular concern about hurting a population and having them taken at various times of the year for falconry. But if there's 6 nesting pairs of ferruginous hawks, we certainly don't want them taking them out of the nest, and we don't want them taking them at all, I don't think. Ferruginous hawks, as you'll note if you have a chance to read this article on page 48 in the magazine that I provided, written by a researcher for the Washington Department of Wildlife that's been working on ferruginous hawks, indicates that 9 states list them as a species of special conservation concern, and 6 states and provinces list them as threatened or endangered or imperiled. And I just think we want to get ahead of this and not be taking and/or contributing to species becoming threatened or endangered in the state. By the same token, I don't think that by the definition that's in the regulations, that there is currently any allowance of golden eagles being taken for falconry in Kansas. However, I think that we should close the door on that because they also have become effectively an extinct nesting species in Kansas, even though they once nested throughout the western half of the state.
Why would somebody from Indiana come to get a Ferruginous hawk?
Because you can't get them in Indiana.
I mean, do they fly faster and land on your arm quicker? I mean,
no, they're one of the largest raptors, and they're particularly good at if you're hunting rabbits, jackrabbits, species of that nature. And the other thing is that there's a pride in, among some people, there's a pride in, well, I got one of those, but you don't. Everybody can have red tail, but I got a Ferruginous hawk, or I got a goshawk, or I got something or other, or so there is that sort of interest. And we're not opposed to falconry, we just do not want to see it depleting imperiled species.
Okay. All right. We have a motion and a second. And we've had some public comment. Is there any more public comment? I'm probably going to suggest that we go ahead and vote on the regulation, but maybe at least have some review on this issue. And I was under the impression that a lot of what we did was consistent with federal falconry guidelines and pretty clear, and we didn't take too much liberty in writing our own rules. So, and I think every falconer in the state, all 78 of them, sent me an email. And so I guess I looked at that perspective and making my decision, but let's review it from Ron's perspective.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, a couple quick comments. We average somewhere between 20 and 30 falconry trapping permits each year. That's resident and non-resident total. And we do send a report card with each of those trapping permits that we issue, and get back as much information as we can. Obviously, a lot of people, a lot of the folks that do get a trapping permit are not successful.
Okay.
Now you got me curious. Has anyone trapped a Ferruginous hawk in the past couple of years that we're aware of?
Yeah, there was a gentleman that's a chief of police from Iowa that did come out this year and trapped a Ferruginous hawk.
Wow.
And yeah, there was a group of folks, like Ron said, from Indiana that came out and attempted, and I don't know that we have gotten a report card back from them yet or not.
Don't we have a master falconer that works for the department, Vanessa?
Yeah.
I mean, does she have a Ferruginous?
I don't remember off the top of my head what Vanessa has.
Yeah.
As far as what kind of birds she has for falconry.
I think to put Mr. Klotaski's mind at rest, perhaps, on page 3, paragraph J1, says when they capture something, they do have to report it. So sometimes we're only as good as our reporters.
I filed a Freedom of Information request. I was curious what they're capturing. And it's within the last 2 months, and got the list of permits, and for most of them it was an unknown, unknown whether they caught anything or not. So we don't have very good records, but we probably need to have a better system, particularly of species of conservation concern. Just a couple years ago, the department had several $100,000 that they were administering that they had gotten from the federal government called the Landowner Incentive Program. And one of the 14 species listed there was Ferruginous hawk, to try and do something to benefit Ferruginous hawks. Well, if a landowner puts up a nesting structure at considerable cost, and then somebody comes along and catches the young that are raised there, or the adults, and in some of these species you can catch them any month of the year, whether they're nesting or not, then it's kind of counterproductive. And I just think that we need to be interested in preserving our wildlife resources and being the best stewards that we can be. And I'm perfectly satisfied with the chairman's suggestion that we take a look at this. Go ahead and move on this, because this is at that stage where you have to enact it. But then let's just step back and over the next few months or whatever time it takes, take a look at what, if anything, needs to be done to protect particular species. But I do think you should consider allowing the department or having the department write regulations that they can do this by species rather than just having it, wide open barn door.
I will make one more quick comment, pardon me, but one of the things I truly believe that a lot of the people that trap, even though we send them a report card, they are required, have been for years, to do a federal report. It's called a 3186A, and one of the features that we just passed these new regulations is there's a new online federal database. So instead of doing just a report card that gets sent to us, these falconers are pretty fastidious about doing 3186A report forms, which cover everything from trapping, sale, transfer, death, all that kind of stuff goes on 3186A report forms. So there is a repository of information for the entire United States.
Okay. Any other comments? Let's have a roll call.
Commissioner Bolton?
Yes.
Commissioner Budd?
Yes.
Commissioner Dill?
Yes.
Commissioner Dahl?
Yes.
Commissioner Marshall?
Yes.
Commissioner Wilson?
Yes.
Commissioner Lauber?
Yes.
Passed 7-0.
Well, that looks like that gets us to the end. Any other things? Anything? Yes.
We've been invited as a commission down to Winfield at Southwestern College for one of our meetings. They would like to host us, and I told them that I would mention that today.
Okay. Sometime in the next year or so, I wouldn't mind going to Yates Center, which is my hometown, if there's a way we can get that worked out.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
in light of those comments, we do have March in Topeka, and we've got April in Wichita, and we'll be going to Garden in June, and then August is at Cheyenne Bottoms, and our suggestion was going to be for Hutch in October. So we have not set October yet. That is a possibility, but again, our suggestion was going to be for Hutch because we were going to try to add in a tourism element that matches with our new mission of the department. If you want to go to Winfield and then Yates Center, if we go, there's, depending on what you guys choose, there's still January of next year, which is not chosen. Then March again would be Topeka and Wichita, and then June. So January and June of next year as we move forward.
January in Winfield, a year from now? That'd be okay with everybody?
14.
Sure. At the college? Yep. And that way we could do Hutch and when?
In October.
Then we want to get Yates Center
In
after.
June.
Unless you want to go to Yates Center in January.
I don't really care. I'm just going to think after several years, it'd be nice, they could probably use the money.
Sure.
And what would it be? Let's see if we can't do January down there and Winfield and April.
June.
June.
Okay.
June of
So everybody's
14.
okay with Hutch, as our suggestion was for the,
So Winfield, June 14, is that right? Somebody give me.
well, I don't know, but not, I mean, that's.
He
20
says June he means
2014.
June 2014.
Yeah, we have plenty of time to set that date. Right?
2014.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I got one question. One of my comments I'm also receiving from the hunters is why we mow all the areas between the fences and the roads and the county roads, and it's concerned about the habitat. Maybe sometime that we could get a kind of report on why we do that, and is that what's in the best interest of everybody?
Yeah, and there may be a chance that we, meaning Wildlife and Parks, doesn't do that, and KDOT does, and I don't know whether they listen to suggestions we have. There have been some people that suggested that if we had, depending on how we did the roadsides, we may minimize some deer vehicle collisions as well. So that's good to look at. I just don't know.
Mr. Chairman, before we go any further, I'm not clear. Where are we going? When are we going to Hutchinson?
In October.
Okay, what's the next meeting after that, and where are we going?
A year from now, January.
Okay, where are we going?
Center.
Good, okay, where are we going after that?
Topeka, Wichita, and then Winfield.
And then June would be our first choice for Winfield?
June of 14.
Can we just plan on that? Is there any reason we can't? Perfect.
Yep, that'd be good.
Perfect.
Is there a reason
I
that
think what you said, June
Topeka,
14,
Wichita,
people thought
they're
you were
just
picking a
set
specific
places
date.
to go
You were
every
talking
year?
about June
We've always done,
2014.
we've always done a Topeka
I
meeting
know
for the
what you-
legislature, and it used to be in January, and it shifted to March.
sir.
Answer your question, to answer your question, I work for KDOT, so I can kind of answer that. On the mowing right-of-ways, a lot of it has to do with visibility issue. Some of it has to do with mowing out to keep back the larger brush control to trees and stuff, so you don't have to go out there and cut them with chainsaws and such. So a lot of it is visual issues with being visibility, wildlife, deer crossing the roads and such. So that's the biggest portion for why they mow the right-of-ways.
Mr. Chairman, we will get your report on that. There has been considerable discussion done on that over the years. Ron, that's one of the few things that Ron and I agree on, and it's not the only thing. You corrected me when I said that the last time. It's the only thing. But we will get your report. Former Secretary Deb Miller had really put in place a pretty good program of trying to alternate where the ditches were mowed. Basically, that was more of a wildflower issue, but it is something that would probably take 20, 30 minutes. We'll try to get it on for the next couple of meetings.
Can I just mention a couple of things, and I'll pay for an indulgence here if necessary. That we have an article in our current magazine on that particular subject, and the Secretary Deb Miller established she called it Aesthetics Task Force. We met throughout the year 2008 and involved a number of different organizations, Wildlife Federation, Audubon, Native Plant Society stuff, and we made a number of recommendations that they implemented. And we've seen a lot of progress there, except that there are 212 different management units within KDOT and the state, and so a lot of those may be regarded as fiefdoms, and they're going to do it the way they've always done it, regardless of who's in Topeka as a governor or who's there as secretary. And so we do have that challenge to overcome. We do encourage you that have letter writing skills or contact with the governor to encourage him to further encourage the Department of Transportation, because he's very much in favor of this approach too, to save money and make the natural environment better. And then Also, on the subject of counties, that's a whole nother ball of wax, and we've got counties where they're spraying everything every year with herbicides, and that is really a war on quail and songbirds when they are eliminating all the forbs and all the the shrubs and stuff. Relative to deer, they're attracted. There's some evidence in Iowa where they have a very, very limited mowing program that actually mowing makes deer collisions worse, because when you mow something off, you get new green shoots coming up, and so the deer get attracted to the roadsides to graze.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
One last thing, one more question. Anticipating the next meeting probably having a lot of discussion, is there anything set in stone as to why we can't start at 1 o'clock and break at 5 or 5:30 and reconvene at 6:30 instead of 7 to try and get a couple extra half hours in there?
That'd be great if I hadn't published the notice today already in
Well,
anticipation
don't be
of the
doing that
meeting, so, based on the timelines, it had to be turned in today.
We have, what, 60 days notice, publication?
60 days notice of publication.
And our meeting date is what?
Plus, you got to count the days that the revisor's office and the Secretary of State needs to publish in the register. It's actually about 80 days, so.
So the meeting after that, if we were to choose to change times, we'd have time. But for the next meeting, we don't have time.
Next time, we're having it at 7 o'clock in March.
One thing we can do is just make sure on the agenda itself that we have plenty of time to take care of those things that are true, and then set aside some briefings that we bring forward and take those.
I like your thought, Keith.
The voting next month, there's a possibility that there may be a lot of discussion, so judge the agenda accordingly.
So if we could follow up on what we had discussed earlier, we set the locations. We don't have a date yet because we were waiting on Don to let us know about August.
I thought we discussed August already. No?
We just have a location. We need a date.
First part of August.
Okay.
It's all about you.
Panic. That's my only really conflict is August, but.
So.
The earlier the better as far as getting hunting rights out.
Yeah.
We have to the waterfowl rights get set at that August meeting, so the earlier in August we get those dates set, the better we are at getting hunting rights out.
There's 8th. When, last year you went when? 15th?
For what it's worth, the last 2 weeks notice.
Yeah, I do. I thought didn't I give you those dates, Sheila? No? Probably
What's the
not.
first Thursday in August?
That would be the first.
That would be perfect.
Okay?
Yep.
August 1st.
Yep.
That would be the earliest we've ever had it, which is fine. I mean, if
We've done a lot of
everybody's
things.
amenable to that.
We've done a lot of things earlier than usual last year.
Yeah, we'll see.
So that's August 1st?
Yep, and then, if we could, just go ahead and, if you guys can look at October, because by the time we get to March, Sheila's gonna be cramped for days, plus we wanna have a tourism element, so. Like October 10th or 17th or the 24th.
Let the
How about
chairman
the
figure this out with
17th?
you guys. on your
What?
own. Let's let the chairman figure this out.
17?
Yeah.
17's good.
Okay, October 17th.
Okay.
And that's all that I needed.
All right. Well, meeting adjourned.
Don't you touch this chicken.